Welcome back, people. We are going into the Cold War in a little bit greater depth today. We're still going to flutter around the Truman administration and we're going to sit there, but instead of going into the roots and the origins in Europe, we are going to expand into Asia, which is going to have a lot of long-lasting impacts. We're going to start a couple different topics today. Big picture stuff, really understanding why is America making these choices in the future. A lot of that contextualization, a lot of that core root is going to come right here. And we're going to develop that idea of tension between the US and the Soviet Union in our first real war in the Cold War. All right, so now we're going to go into Asia, which is not something that we've really had the opportunity to do throughout this course much at all, but we're going to spend a lot of time in Asia for the rest of this course. It's going to be extremely, extremely important. So let us begin. Now, one thing that we're really going to see during the Cold War, especially at the early eras, and then even going on, there's going to be different moments where that military presence is going to spike up. But in a war, we typically think of the military, and that is something that is not new for this time period. We're going to have three different new agencies that are created, hopefully, to help us have a better, quicker, more calculated, specific response. We are going to create new kind of cabinet positions or areas of the U.S. military, like the Department of Defense, right? A branch specifically dedicated to direct the Army, the Navy, and our brand new Air Force. The Air Force is going to be a preferred tool in the Cold War because of bombing capabilities, quick strike, recon abilities, deterring enemy attacks that it could come from any angle at any time. It's really going to change the way that war is fought with this aerial dimension. And so we're going to invest a lot of money into this aerial kind of group, as well as eventually space. Next, we have the Central Intelligence Agency, aka the CIA. There's a lot of information flooding in. We need to make sure we know what our enemies are doing. Are there things that are popping up in other countries that we need to be aware of? Is there going to be a coup? Is there going to be a different attack, military movement? The CIA is very important, and as well as the National Security Council. It's a council specifically made just to advise the president on what is the best decisions for national security. So we have all these different levels of it. We have a group managing all of our armed forces, a group managing all the intel and what's happening around the world, and then also the National Security Council, which is helping to advise the president in the best way possible. So militarily, things are drastically changing. Notice this is really starting in 1947, just 2 years after World War II. So this is not anything that deep into the Cold War. This is starting from the very beginning. One part that makes the nuclear discussion interesting and scary at the same time is this idea of an arms race, right? Arms meaning weapons, right? A race is who's going to have the biggest and the baddest, who's going to have it more, who's going to have it fastest. In 1945, when we used the atomic bombs on Japan, we are the only country in the world with nuclear capability. But by 1949, just 4 years after World War II, the Soviet Union successfully tests their own atomic weapon, which is scary, number one, but there's something even more scary about it. We haven't told them how to make it. We haven't given them the specs. We haven't given them the tools. So how could someone just randomly create this so quickly after we do, right? They don't even really know, perhaps, what's going on with this bombing. How can they do this so quickly without any aid or help? Well, there may be only one solution. If you have a secret and there's two people, right, multiple people in this group, but we'll say for this analogy, there's only two people. There's a secret between me and you, and I didn't tell it, and no one else would know. I know you would have had to. So that means that someone opened their mouth. The big question is who? We have spies in this country. We have espionage inside the highest level of the federal government, the most dangerous thing we have ever produced, the most top secret level, and they got spies into that level? How? So this fear, paranoia throughout the United States is going to bloom throughout the 1950s about, oh my God, there are definitely spies everywhere. Anybody could be a spy if they're looking funny, acting funny, walking funny. They could be a spy. Now, the Soviets test the atomic bomb. They're successful in 1949. And so America, right, is like, all right, That's what you can do. We're going to try something even bigger. In 1952, just 3 years later, the United States creates and tests the very first hydrogen bomb. It is different than an atomic bomb. It is much, much more powerful. This has never been used in combat before, but has been tested. A hydrogen bomb is the equivalent of dropping 1,000 atomic bombs in a single space. This is a whole new level, right? A whole new level of destruction, devastation. But America now has that higher calling card. So if the Soviets start to get a little crazy, we can threaten to use this weapon. But 1 year later, the Soviets create their own H-bomb. So this back and forth is continually going. If you want to check about how devastating an atomic bomb is, like the ones dropped in World War II, versus hydrogen bomb, check out this link up above. It shows a lot of devastation just to show you how big it is. But this back and forth is really driving Americans crazy. So nuclear war is now most definitely on the table. 1952, we have the hydrogen bombs of today, but both countries have the atomic weapons. So now it's not like I have a gun and you have a knife, where I got more power in this situation, right? We both got guns. We got both really, really, really big guns, both pointed at each other. So this is going to kind of create this dimension. What happens if I pull that trigger? You're going to pull that trigger too. Is that going to mean that I'm going to be destroyed? Should we use these weapons if we have them? What are going to be the repercussions? There are a lot of questions still kind of unanswered about this. And this takes us to Asia. Remember, our policy at this point in the world is a policy of containment, right? We are containing communism. That is our threat, is we're going to help any single nation threatened by communism that is willing to resist it. Asia is beginning to be completely divided, not just Europe. We helped set up a democracy in Japan after the unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire, right? Pulling down the emperor, right? We signed an alliance with the Japanese, but that's not the end of the story. The Japanese invaded, right, a country, China. We are not going to have that best relationship with China, as we just signed an alliance with this country that did devastating, awful, horrific things to the Chinese people. At the same time, right, in couple years prior, America is not going to have that same development with China. A new revolutionary leader, Mao Zedong, is going to successfully lead a communist revolution in China. Mao is a huge figure. You cannot forget about him when we're talking about Asian politics. China is going to be heavily involved. This is a huge, sharp contrast from like the open door policy at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. China is definitely going to be more of a world player, and Mao is going to propel China to a much higher international role than they ever were in the past. A communist leader is taking over. In our minds, we've lost China. China is a massive country, a lucrative kind of jewel in Asia from the kind of the early 1900s viewpoint. We want to be these big trade partners, and we've lost them. Not only have they not become democratic, they've become communist and heavily aligned themselves with the Soviet Union by 1950. So we are not doing well in Asia. Asia is being dominated in our mind by communism. There is this this treaty is really signed, and the context of it is super important. America does not recognize Mao and the government that he is setting up as legitimate. And you need, as a new country, to be recognized as legitimate, to have trade partners, to have alliances, for people to respect you, to have international kind of security and foundation. America refuses to do that, kind of how we refuse to recognize the communist government set up after the Bolshevik Revolution, after World War I. Creates a lot of animosity there, more animosity here. And because of that and their closer political alignment, the Soviet Union and China are going to sign an assistance treaty. They're going to become allies, close allies. And Mao and Stalin are going to be much more cooperative. This is ultimately our worst nightmare. Now, to show you what the world is going to look like, because most of your geography is very, very not good, to put it lightly. This gives you a scope of what Asia looks like. How much of it is controlled just by these two countries, but all the countries they're going to kind of swallow up and be a part of going forward. Now, this is not the end of the Cold War by any means, but look how much they control in Asia. There are some certain areas right? And we can see those areas right here that they do not have complete control of, but they control a large portion of it, easily over 50%, pushing towards over 75% easily. So there's a lot of land there that we do not control. And these are massive countries as well. This is extremely alarming for Americans. Now, what's happening in China is going to be more indicative of the larger whole, where the US will support one side of it. In this case, we support the nationalist government. Meanwhile, the communists are supporting, or the Soviets are supporting the communist side. And so there's kind of like a civil war going on in a lot of different countries for control of the government. We're supporting one side, the Soviets are supporting the other. We are not directly fighting Soviet troops, but we are funding other people to sort of fight for us, almost as pawns. That's not really going to work well with public opinion going after, especially if we lose. So that's going to be create a lot of problems here. We have the nationalist government in southern China and Mao's government in northern China. Right? We have a lot of support in the southern part. Meanwhile, the communists have a lot of support in the northern part. Again, closer to it, these are the regions that the Soviet Union taken over. There's the region where a lot of the devastation was felt by the Japanese Empire, right? And for the communists, the message is liberation. It's very similar to kind of the Bolshevik Revolution around World War I. The people that they have the most public support of are peasants. It's the lower class. They have a lot of public support for this movement. The idea is that they're preaching this idea of taking care of the little people, giving protection, distribution of wealth. And Mao has a lot of experience. It's military warfare, it's guerrilla warfare, and we see this trend over and over and over again. Whether we're going to look at what happens in Vietnam or we look back at the American Revolution, right, of this kind of guerrilla warfare being very, very effective. Now, in accomplishing this goal, there's a lot of propaganda that goes into this. Understanding the messages, it's not unique to the United States or any country that uses propaganda. For example, in this context, we're going to look at Chinese communist propaganda, looking at the message. And one way we can understand messages of political cartoons is symbolism, right? Size, labeling. Now, I'm guessing none of you watching this video right now can read Mandarin, and that's okay. You don't have to, right? There's that adage that picture thinks 1,000 words, right? In the center, we have that picture of Mao, right? Very powerful in the light of the sun, very influential figure. And meanwhile, you have all the little people down below kind of bowing down like he is like a god. He's very, very powerful. He is this rising power that is going to help China propel itself. Really, we see that push. We also see the type of people that they advertise towards. We see people like industrial workers or communists, women, farmers by the profession. We know these communists by this book that he has in his hand up here. That little red book is kind of like the communist Bible in a lot of these, especially in China, Mao's Bible, if you will. But it's this revolution of happening. And notice it's not the rich, it's not the wealthy, it's the individual people. He has the support of the masses. You also have this message of it will be struggling hard. We'll be struggling hard for a couple of years, but we're going to change the face of China. They will put China on the world map, promising economic success and prosperity. If we all work together, we can start a people's revolution, right? And this great leap forward movement is really going to take hold. It's a lot of message we've seen in other places. We've seen it even in the United States, where kind of like the New Deal out of the Great Depression, where we're pushing for some success moving forward. But again, the type of people, farmers and industrial workers, the sickle and the hammer that we see in communism, right, ultimately make it a more industrial modern country. Now, this war happens, the government or the force under Mao is going to take over China. They're going to invade that island of Taiwan to really shut down the resist, what their mind is the nationalist forces, and they're going to take over this country. And Mao is going to be kind of on the same level of people, these major communist leaders, like we have Marx, we have Lenin, and now we have Mao. From the American point of view, this was the worst case possible. We have failed. Containment failed. They've broken this seal, and it's not just a tiny little know-nothing country. This is a massive country. This is a huge loss. Americans feel like if we lost China, what else is going to be next? That this is the worst case scenario that we have, right? That there's nothing else that we can do right now. We need to take different action. We need to take drastic action. We can't let this expand any further. And one basic philosophy that's really passed around at this time is this belief in the domino theory, right? So you may have seen these crazy videos where people set up these ridiculously long kind of domino chains throughout school or throughout their house, whatever. And what happens when you knock one over, right? When you knock one over, it hits the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. If you take this and you apply this to these countries during this time period, you're going to see a similar development. If one falls, then they all fall. If China falls, what's next? Korea? What's next after that? Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia? Where will this stop? So America has to wedge itself in there somewhere to stop this fall from happening. We can't let this become a chain reaction, or sooner or later, the rest of the world is going to be engulfed in communism. So we've already seen China fall. The next country that could be affected could be Korea. So that's where America is going to step its foot in next. So right around the same time that the Chinese and the Soviets create a mutual kind of assistance treaty, an alliance, if you will, the NSC, the National Security Council, is going to create a brand new national defense plan. You're going to notice this lettering, NSC 68. NSC stands for National Security Council. It's going to be kind of the same way that executive orders are done, where they're just kind of given a number. Like we saw Executive Order 9066, which was for the Japanese internment. NSC 68 kind of becomes this blueprint or this philosophy that is going to be used to base all future policies on for the next 20 years about how we're going to handle the Cold War. So it's a really, really good thing to have an idea about. It's going to label communism as fanatical, meaning crazy lunatics that we need to stop. It's a permanent threat to the world. This isn't something that's going to just dissipate on its own. The U.S. is at risk. The rest of the world is at risk. So what is America going to do about it? Containment is not working. It's not just containment. If there are countries that are infected or held prison by communism from the American point of view, we must liberate. We are going to be infiltrating these countries to help liberate them from communism, not just stopping it from spread. So this is taking it a notch up, right? We're turning it up a little bit, right? Biggest things that propel this, number one, the Soviets' development of an atomic bomb. This is this fear that now we're on equal level playing field. Things are going to get a bit hastier. Things are going to get a little bit feistier. Number two, us losing, right, and understanding that philosophy that we lost China. China should have been protected, and we lost it to the communists. We have to win them back. We have to win this globe back from communism. And this comprehensive view of the Soviet Union and of China is really going to be used to develop all of our decisions going forward. So it's not just important enough to understand what the decisions are, but why these decisions are being made, how we view them. We view them as a threat. And this plan is going to provide a couple things that they suggest should happen. Expansion of the military, because we need to infiltrate and fight and liberate these countries, so we need the troops and the weapons to do so. Stockpiling nuclear weapons, whole different area, right, of warfare that we need to get ready for. That this is going to drastically change things. So nuclear buildup is going to be huge. And a lot of covert operations. We need intel, we need espionage, we need to stop things, we need to influence elections. We are going to assassinate leaders. There's going to be a lot of things going on to try to infiltrate other countries that are affected by communism or that could possibly be to try to prevent it. So we're going to take a lot of different measures. And ultimately, not long after this is drafted, only 3 months later, our kind of assertions or beliefs are going to be assumed to be correct. North Korea is going to attack South Korea. This is where the U.S. military buildup is really going to begin. So we're going to go into our very first war inside of the Cold War. So where does this whole thing start? Post-World War II, like a lot of these early issues, Korea is going to be divided. Korea is this peninsula that's off the northeastern coast of China. In this, you are going to see Korea divided. This is the area where the Soviets are invading into, and we're trying to figure out what are we going to do with this chunk of land that the Japanese had, this chunk of land that they invaded and took control of. And so Korea is going to be divided. They're going to be divided along the 38th parallel, right? So if you make the shape of the mouth, you're talking about latitude, east to west, right? So if you over exaggerate that latitude, you're going to make like an oval with your mouth going left to right, right? We're talking about a division, a parallel division. The Soviet Union is going to be supportive of the communist regime in the north, and the USA is going to be supportive of this democratic regime in the south. Ultimately, what's going to happen in 1950, North Korean troops that are trained by the Soviet army, that are trained by the Soviet forces, again, these are not the Soviet troops that are invaded, but North Korean supported and trained Soviet troops. So they are not fighting, but they are fighting through someone else. Both Stalin and Mao approved the attack, but ultimately, I love this kind of quote. It's very Stalin, cutthroat, ruthless, right? If you should get your teeth kicked in, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for help. The Soviet Union's not going to get involved. Stalin is not going to directly be involved in this war, but he's going to train those troops. And so what's going to happen, right? The United Nations is definitely going to condemn Korea, and the UN is going to send troops, but a predominant amount of them, along with United States troops, are going to be sent over to Korea to help fight this war. Now, what's important to understand is there's going to be this back and forth. You see that little GIF in the background, stole that from Crash Course. But the Korean War is definitely going to span across two different presidencies. You have Truman, right, versus Eisenhower. And that sort of back and forth is really going to develop this story that we're going to have to go deeper into. Truman is not going to be able to finish the job. His term is going to run out. 1952, it's going to be a brand new election. General Eisenhower, the same Eisenhower from World War II and D-Day, he is going to take over as president for the rest of the 1950s. So we have the Korean War. Now, the Korean War is usually overshadowed or sort of forgotten about because of the Vietnam War, but it's still very important. It's the earliest real war and conflict that we have rooted in the Cold War. And so just this little graphic that I have over the map, I'm going to show you a lot of maps from here on out, but this is split, the northern half being the communist side, the southern half being the democratic side. Basically, the north being supported by the Soviet Union, the south being supported by the USA. Now, as this begins and the North Korean invasion happens, they move deep, deep into South Korea. And by the time that the UN forces and the United States forces actually do land in South Korea and help kind of repel these forces, it's really, really, really bleak. Now, the UN and the US launch their counterattack and very quickly repel the North Korean forces all the way up into the north, and they're almost all but depleted. This is where a lot of things get complex. Do we need to take over the whole country? Are we just trying to maintain? How far do we go? But as we push further north, it's going to put a lot of stress on China. And again, just for your geographic needs, China, right here, right, is going to feel very threatened by this, and China is going to get more directly involved in this Korean War. The Chinese are going to support, they're going to continue to push back all the way past that 38 parallel line. The UN troops are going to evacuate, and they're going to go all the way back to the southern portion, and a lot of this ground is really lost within just a couple of months. It's this back and forth trend, this back and forth kind of fight. Ultimately, Truman is not going to be successfully able to end the Korean War. And one of the biggest reasons is disagreements between him and the lead general of the United States Army in the Pacific, General MacArthur. General MacArthur was the lead general during the War in the Pacific in World War II, and they're going to go kind of toe-to-toe in a lot of disagreements, and Truman is actually going to fire Douglas MacArthur, which is going to be extremely controversial, really big news, but ultimately he's not going to be able to solve this issue. By the end of 1951 and going into 1952, Eisenhower is going to be the next president who's going to next person who's going to run for president following Truman. He's going to make it a huge campaign issue. His military experience is really going to help him bolster it. And he's going to take over in 1952. But more on this MacArthur and Truman issue. The big disagreement came into what should we be doing? What should our goal be here? Should we completely take over the country, like full submission, no holds bar? Or should we limit ourselves in our expansion? Should the U.S. troops only push up to the 38th parallel and leave it at that? That becomes the big fear. MacArthur wants to unify North and South Korea and just make it Korea, that this split and division is going to make problems for the future. If we shut that down completely, liberate this country, we'll be good. Truman is more fearful of a world war than he wants to actually unify Korea. And so because of these disagreements, it's going to get real nasty. It's going to hit the newspapers at some point. There's questions of should we use nuclear warfare? Should we not? Should we threaten this? But again, Truman's fearful of these repercussions. He relieves Douglas MacArthur as the head of the U.S. Army. Huge, huge news. Ultimately, this isn't going to be completely resolved by then, and it's going to be a lot of this stalemate back and forth, back and forth. 1953, Eisenhower is in office, and this 38th parallel is completely restored. Now, what happens is there's kind of this back and forth kind of exchange here. On one hand, Truman's goal is achieved. South Korea is defended, the communist forces do not take over. But also on the other hand, America really shows that we're willing to fight this war now, that it's no longer a war of words. We put troops in there, we're willing to go to whatever lengths. And so again, this continuously escalates the Cold War further and further. It's not just talking against the communists. We've actually gone into war and we will fight. This armistice is signed, this peace agreement is signed by the end of July of 1953, and the war is done, restoring that 38th parallel line. That armistice line is a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, that still stands today. And so North and South Korea still are separate countries. They are not a unified country. They are separate. So the Korean War, again, isn't in a vacuum like anything else. There's a lot of support. The communist influence is growing in Asia, and we're still very fearful of that. We were able to successfully stop and repel the North Koreans from completely taking over the South Koreans. And so as a result, North and South Korea are still separate today. Now, the leader of North Korea, the leader in charge of communist North Korea, still in the same family of Kim Jong-un still today. So there is that long-lasting connection of these impacts. So do we take it over? No, but allows for that power still to rise and stay in that family. China, obviously heavy directly involved, but that influence is really starting to spread. We see the country of Russia all the way up here at the top, right? We see North Korea right here, right? We see China right here, right? And now there's another country in Southeast Asia that we're going to start to get involved with in Vietnam. And the reason we become more involved in this country is because there are other European countries that still have colonies in other parts of the world, especially in Southeastern Asia. And in that Indian Pacific Ocean region, France in particular is involved in a country called Vietnam. In Vietnam, there is an independence movement that's brewing, a communist movement that's brewing, and a leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh is starting to attempt to liberate itself from this decades of French rule. As this revolution begins, America starts to become more involved in it. We see this as more vested interest, again, stopping communism, liberating these countries from communism. And really, this is going to pick up in the 1960s and 1970s. An incident that we know in American history is the Vietnam War. Now, if we want to close things off for this video, another good little resource for you is this YouTube link right here. It's from the History Channel. They do the last kind of quick rapid fire things you need to know about the Korean War in less than 5 minutes. It's a nice little resource for you just to review the bigger overarching things. It'll typically get overshadowed in a lot of students' minds by the Vietnam War, but it is really important for understanding the ground rules for a lot of things that happen. Truman's presidency really sets the framework of a lot of things to come, and the Cold War story is built on top of that. There are some incidents that happen, and we're attempting to contain it, and we're successful in some, we fail in others, but there's a lot of story to be developed off of this. So these takeaways can really connect to not only this video, but the first video on Truman's Cold War, the overview of the Cold War, and branching into Europe, but especially for things like this. In the 1940s, post-World War II, and early 1950s, the Cold War is really going to dominate American thoughts and the American focus. Reason why? Massive amount of expenditure on defense, whether that be the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, kind of nuclear expenditures, covert operations, whatever may be the increasing size of the federal government. In addition, right? In addition, we also have this nuclear arms race that's really making people anxious as well. It's not just going to be the big foreign affairs decisions, but also in the domestic life. If all of these countries are building up nuclear warheads, what does that mean for us? What if they don't like us and they bomb us? How are we going to defend ourselves? Can we defend ourselves? What are our plans for doing this? How can we protect ourselves? How can we protect our children? There's all these big questions that are really, really raised. But after Eisenhower is elected, the Korean War gets shut down very, very quickly, and anxieties about the Cold War and really do subdue very quickly. There are going to be some domestic effects that we'll talk about in another video, but it's really going to kind of lower itself down and mellow out very quickly for the most part, because the Cold War then becomes much more covert. It's not these big kind of guns blazing invasions. There's not going to be a lot of overt things that are happening in the 1950s after the Korean War. There will be some things that are happening behind the scenes, a lot of strings being pulled, and a lot of political decisions, economic decisions, but it's going to drastically change in the 1950s. The 1950s, you're going to see a lot of increase in wealth, in prosperity, in standard of living, and it's really going to bring up a lot of questions about American society as the foreign affairs side gets to be put on the back burner for the American public. See you next time. If you've got any questions, drop some questions down in the comment section. I'll get back to you as soon as I can.